So thanks so much, everyone, for getting together today to create this most recent edition of ORWAC's Ask the Oracle. We're here to consider the question, what should be the trajectories of feminist work in the communication discipline at this time? It is not a new question.
This is not a particularly creative question.
It's not an easy question.
It's not a question with a clear and concise answer.
This question is laborious to answer.
This question must be asked time and time again.
This question should hang over us as we work toward greater diversity and inclusion in our field, guiding us and reminding us that in every moment when misogyny and patriarchy continue to illustrate the human experience, feminism has a specific purpose and a particular path.
This question can't ignore that at this very moment, the United States has erupted onto itself in a passionate rebuke of the anti-Black racism in the wake of the deaths of individuals such as George Floyd, Tony McDade, and Breonna Taylor.
This question cannot ignore that the rebuke of anti-Black racism has been met with pepper spray and rubber bullets.
This question cannot forget that for the past months, the world's population has existed in relative isolation from one another, and that the most marginalized amongst us will bear the greatest consequences of a global pandemic.
This question comes during Pride Month, when Black trans and trans women of color started the revolution for queer liberty.
Individuals like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who paved a way for their family across the nation.
This is a question that must hold space for Black, people of color, queer, differently abled, non-binary, intersectional, performative, transnational, multimodal, progressive, and justice-oriented voices every time that it is asked.
And that is the work that we are here to embark on today.
And we want to thank you for agreeing to do this labor with us. Sarah and I will begin by introducing ourselves and our inspirations for this project. Then we'll invite our esteemed panel to respond to the question, what should be the trajectories of feminist work in the communication discipline at this time? We'll conclude with a brief response and thanks to our panel, followed by a question and answer section. To begin, Sarah will share a bit about herself and her inspirations for conducting this project.
So my name is Sarah Dweik, and I'm going to be a first-year PhD candidate at the Pennsylvania State University. I study rhetoric regarding social movements and public memory and imagination in the Middle East, with a primary focus on Palestine. One of the conversations that I've heard a lot about as a master's student is one of citational politics, and how we should all work our hardest to cite scholars that occupy minority identity categories. With this, I believe that mentorship is critical in abiding by citational politics, because without proper exposure or guidance from mentors and professors, students will always fall prey to those hegemonic knowledge empires and only replicate its knowledge. Understanding how we can embody practices from our mentors that do not replicate or enforce structures of violence is how we can begin to share that knowledge and disseminate it with our colleagues, our cohorts, and our students, so we can in turn become better mentors ourselves. At this point, Kristen would like to introduce herself and her inspirations behind this project.
I am Kristen D. Herring. I am about to be a third-year PhD student at Colorado State University. I study feminist rhetorical theory and criticism with an interest in performance methods and musical rhetorics. I was inspired to do this project because despite the fact that most of my peers would say that they work from feminist perspectives, very few of them actually identify as explicitly feminist scholars, which leads me to wonder where we're going and if it's in a direction that can fascinate and encapsulate for the work of new generations of feminist thinkers. I vehemently believe that feminist scholarship can and will inspire new generations of feminists, and that the group that we have with us today is evidence of just that. At this point, Sarah would like to introduce our esteemed panel.
So thank you everybody for being here today. Our first panelist that we will have speaking is Dr. Bernadette Calafell, who's a professor and chair of critical race and ethnic studies at Gonzaga University. Dr. Calafell's research focuses on women of color feminisms, queer of color theories, performance studies, critical rhetoric, and monstrosity or horror. Our second panelist that we'll have today is Dr. Shinsuke Eguchi, who's an associate professor at the University of New Mexico. As a critical intercultural scholar, Dr. Eguchi's research has been guided by critical race theory and queer color critique. Our third panelist will be Dr. Karma Chávez, who's an associate professor and department chair at the University of Texas at Austin's Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies. Dr. Chávez's scholarship is informed by queer color theory and women of color feminism, as it intersects with rhetorics of social movement building, activist rhetoric, and coalitional politics. Our fourth panelist that we'll have today is Dr. Godfried Asante, who is an associate professor of communication studies at Drake University. Dr. Asante's research focuses on social identities such as race, class, gender, and sexuality in transnational contexts to explore how social inequalities and human rights violations are enacted and reproduced. Our fifth panelist that we'll have today is Dr. Jenna N. Hanchey, who's an assistant professor and graduate studies director at the University of Nevada, Reno. Dr. Hanchey's research is anti-colonial and situated at the intersection of rhetorics of international aid and assistance, nonprofit organizing, and post-structural theories.
Okay. So I guess what I'll say is I didn't prepare of anything formal because I think it's more important to speak just generally from the heart and talk. I mean, everything I'm going to say, I pretty much have said in my work. So I will go that way. In terms of the question that you asked about what should the trajectories of feminist work in the communication discipline at the time, like what should they be? It's really interesting for me, given that I'm not in the communication discipline anymore. And part of the reason why I'm not in the communication discipline anymore is because of the slowness of getting to what I think the trajectories of feminist communication should be. So that I want to start there. The second thing I'll say is that, my current position is in critical race and ethnic studies, and it's a brand new program. And at the heart of our position is really kind of driven by demonstrating how white supremacy is underlying everything, right? It's an intersectional approach to look at, anti-racism, to practice anti-racism, to reveal structures of white supremacy, to think about how capitalism, racism, and patriarchy work together to structure the ways that we experience the world. And so I think when I'm asked this question about communication studies, I think we've got to start with some basic, I think it's such a contested state that we have to start with some basics. Like, I think it's even hard for folks in comm studies to even agree that intersectionality is an important aspect of feminist communication studies. I think it's hard for people to understand what the relationship is to settler colonialism, right? I think we need to be honest as well about not just proclaiming that we are anti-racist and anti-patriarchal, all these things, but what does that do in terms of our theory and our praxis, right? So what does it mean beyond just I saw an article yesterday about performative allyship. What does it do in terms of our everyday actions, not just those that we're doing and sharing a hashtag on Twitter or such? So that's kind of the thing, I think. And when people ask me generally, like when I teach my undergrad or grad seminars in feminism, I say that you have to start, for me at least, with trans feminism if you want to really be accountable to a really critical, ethical, feminist critique. And a part of that as well is, as I said, we're talking about how white supremacy structures everything. We have to be willing to talk about how this is a global issue, it's transnational. We have to think transnationally, and how that's connected as well to discourses around sexuality, whether it's heteronormativity, whether it's homonormativity, But those are the kind of things that I think we need to do in communication studies. And I think, you know, Dr. Chávez has really done a lot of that work, and Dr. Eguchi as well, and Dr. Asante and Dr. Hanchey. Everyone here has done this work, right? But I think for me, that is where I go with that question is, I often feel like we're all having this conversation and it's a broken record, but in many cases, it's taken us too long to get there, right? And so we need a sense of urgency behind what we're doing, right? And that's where the praxis comes in beyond the theory. So the praxis has to drive our theory, right? Or else we're not going to get anywhere. So that's my concern. And I talked a lot about, in the past, I've written about this idea of Daisy Duke feminisms, right? Where you have like white women who are riding along with the good old boys to support the patriarchy. And I think that we need to have honest conversations about that as well in our field. And I think that, you know, a lot of folks aren't ready for it. So that's kind of what I was thinking when you asked those questions of us.
For those of you who are just tuning in, Dr. Calafell has just shared with us a wonderful response to the question that we've posed to this panel. And while we won't ask you to completely repeat it, because again, I think it was beautiful and wonderful just the way it was, I would like to provide some space here if you'd like to comment again or say anything further before we move to our next panelist.
No, I think I'm good. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, then in that case, thank you so much for your response. And at this point, we would like to invite Dr. Eguchi to share their response.
Hi, everyone. First, I'd like to thank you to Kristen and Sarah for organizing this, and also Jenna to be part of this. But also, I'm so happy to be able to present with my friends, Dr. Calafell, Dr. Chávez, and Dr. Asante. So I'm very happy about this. So the question, what should be like feminist research in the future should look like? So first, you know, I'm not a woman, so I don't want to tell all the women what they should do. But I think when I think about feminist research, that includes also women, men, queer, non-binary, all those people. So for me, I would like to kind of point out in a larger discourse around it. So I have a kind of point. So first, I would like to see, I mean, all of us here, Dr. Chávez, Calafell, and Asante showcase, we need to do more complex race analysis of gender and sexuality and the body, so forth. I mean, right now, everything seems to be white, black, or white Latinx, white Asian. A lot of people don't complicate around that. So to me, I like to hear more complex analysis about how those, even the color-to-color communication take place and so forth as well. And as I am thinking about what's going on in the society, 2020 is too tough and dramatic and extra for me. Even me, I'm an extra person, but I can't take it anymore. So I would like to reinforce the idea, the body. I think feminist research or communication people sometimes tend to say the body doesn't matter. You know, this body, we should be able to study anything, but in reality, the body is the site that what we study, what we write about, what we really speak and all of that, and we cannot forget the body we have. So whatever the feminist research where we go, we have to really talk about it, because in particular, I am questioning some scholars certainly go to some nation in Africa and come back and tell us, you should be all reflexive about it. I'm like, you should be also reflexive of studying about the other. This has been already set for last 30 or 40 years in a culture, and we are still talking about the same issue. So I like the people to really start to think about the body one more time. But also, as Dr. Calafell said, I would also like to echo that intersectionality is still important. I think communication scholars either really use intersectionality in a multiple identity negotiation, or for those who critique intersectionality, literally don't want to talk about other identification that plays into the complexity of race or gender or something. So I think that is important to think about. But also part of this women's studies in COM or Western States ORWAC organization I respect so much, but I like to see more turn in terms of transnationalism and globalization. And I think Dr. Calafell also mentioned about even, old Americans, somewhat their presence here in the United States is already part of the globalization and settler colonialism. But also US Academy is really the site of creating knowledge for the world. So for me, I like to see more voices from international scholars and transnational scholars whose voices are oftentimes not seriously taken, because sometimes we don't have languages to articulate what we think to appeal to American audience. And with that said, I think another point I was thinking about is language. And language, I just don't mean by English or Spanish or Japanese. I mean that language, when we speak, the sound and accent and all of that, or thought processes, can be really take place throughout the language linguistic processes. And I would like to see more complex way of theorizing that, instead of just people talking about English hegemony is bad, so that blah, blah, blah. We need to go beyond that a little bit. Not to say that English is not a matter. English is obviously a global imperialist language. We know that. So let's go deeper to it, right? And I think lastly, I kind of touch on the body conversation, but once again, it's reflexivity. And in particular, I was inspired last weekend that one of the scholars posted the comment about, a white scholar said to other white people, just listen, just apologize if you make a mistake to people of color, kind of preach about it. But to me, once again, that's not the reflexivity. Reflexivity is really about you start to really interrogate what you made a mistake, what you really learned from it, and then really take time. And sometimes being quiet is okay. So to me, I need a communication scholar to really understand what reflexivity is. And I'm not saying not everybody's understand. There are so many people who do a really good job on theorizing it. But sometimes when we think about feminist research, in particular segment of scholars, there seems to be a little bit superficial tendency to talk about reflexivity, language, transnationalism, globalization, intersectionality, and the body and race. So that's where I come from. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eguchi, for your response. I think it was a very enlightening understanding of how we should move forward and make sure that we don't ignore specific aspects of how we understand communication, how we decide to illustrate that further in our research as we move forward, and not to ignore certain aspects that we maybe take for granted, or sometimes even just it's so normalized that we forget to discuss it at all. So thank you so much for your response. At this point, we would like to invite Dr. Karma Chávez to share their response.
Thank you. So you'll hear some similar themes across what my esteemed colleagues have already said, but I think that's probably a good thing. I was thinking about this question, I think, from two vantage points. So one very similar to Bernadette's, being someone who made the choice to leave the field in terms of where I'm housed and tenured in my university. So moving, to ethnic studies full-time, as opposed to before it kind of being a part-time thing, and comm was my full-time gig. And the second position I've been thinking about this question from is I'm working right now. I'm one of the members of the collective that is editing the Keywords for Gender and Sexuality Studies volume with NYU Press that, well, it was supposed to be out in 2021 and COVID happened, so we'll see. And thinking about the ways that we're thinking about these questions, and for the field of gender and women's studies, basically. So not exactly the same, but definitely related. And so we've been working on the introduction for that volume, and one of the things that we ran up against this week is what we've all run up against this week, right? Which is the reality that many people in this country and globally don't think Black Lives Matter. Yeah. And that now, in the midst of a global pandemic, which is already disproportionately impacting Black and brown lives, Black people and Black and brown people are in the streets to protest against state violence. and putting themselves at risk for this disease. And so how do you write about something, how do you think about something like feminism that has activist origins, but has in a way become institutionalized, particularly in a moment when the world is a sort of dystopian dumpster fire, right? And so what's the upshot for us? For me, the question is, not always, of course, does feminist theory have to respond to the real world, but actually feminist theory does always have to respond to the real world. Now there's benefit to just engaging in sort of intellectual theoretical exercises, but the bottom line is we need to take our theory in directions that is going to help us answer the most pressing questions of our moment, questions that are literally, quite literally, a matter of life and death. And feminist theory, I think, has always provided resources for that. I think if you asked any of us in this group, we would probably say that there's some feminist or set of feminists, women of color more than likely, that when we are at our worst, we turn to them, right? So for me, it's Audre Lorde, it's June Jordan, it's Gloria Anzaldúa, right? I go there to find the answers. And so if feminist theory and communication, feminist studies and communication wants to be relevant on into the future, it has to do that for somebody. It has to be the thing that people turn to for answers in their hardest times. And I don't think it is that right now. Maybe a little bit, some of the pieces folks in this room have written. I think there's definitely pieces Bernadette has written that people turn to in that way. But that's a pretty rare thing, I would say. And so I think the work becomes that way when we've challenged ourselves to address the most pressing problems, when we have done so in a way that decenters white feminism, when we've done so in a way that takes Black feminism, indigenous feminism, and transnational feminism very, very seriously and puts those analyses at the center. And when we've done so in a way that's deeply interdisciplinary. And I think people in communication, we or you, I don't know whether to say we anymore, but I'll say we for now, we get a chip on our shoulder about the fact that nobody else reads our work outside of the discipline. And, you know, there's always a lamenting about, well, any number of reasons, but maybe that's a question we should really sit and reflect on. Why don't people read us outside of the field? What are we doing wrong? And so I guess maybe that's the challenge that I would leave us with as we're considering what the trajectory of feminist work in comm should be at this moment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chávez, for prompting us to always respond to the real world. And at this point, we would like to invite Dr. Asante to share their response.
So thank you again for the opportunity, Sarah and Kristen, to contribute to this wonderful gathering of scholars. As someone who takes on African feminists and also queer African approaches to the study of communication and rhetoric, you know, I think the future trajectory of feminist scholarship can take these areas. And again, I'm going to follow suit with Dr. Eguchi in talking about, you know, I'm a man, so definitely not sort of occupying these feminist spaces when I'm not needed. But I do take feminist approaches in my own research because I was also looking for answers as a queer man. So I think these three areas here are one, bridging the gap between research and community needs, and also being self-critical. And lastly, I'll talk about being deeply decolonial. I always return to Barbara Christian's article on the race for theory that was published in Feminist Studies in 1988, quite a while ago, where she describes how because gatekeepers such as editors, reviewers, and those on the editorial board have and maintain power on what can be published and thereby determine the ideas that are deemed valuable, some people of color and third grade scholars are sort of co-opted, or in some sense, forced to speak a language and define their scholarship in terms that are sometimes alien to them. But and also some of these kinds of scholarships sometimes are opposed to their needs and orientation. And this debate is particularly relevant to me as an African queer scholar in the US, where sometimes I feel, you know, they have two different worldviews. But I mean, I was and I am fortunate to have mentors who are here, most of them who are actually part of this gathering right now, who have really encouraged me to delve into the cultural particularities and specificities of the setting that I am actually writing about. But I know this is not the same for everyone out there. So I think moving forward, thinking about how feminist scholarship need to reach out and bring in voices who use alternative ways of theorizing traditionally unwelcomed in feminist circles. So the second part of this, I think we've all mentioned this, and I'm going to rehash the same points here in thinking about how feminist scholarship moving forward, of course, also needs to be self-critical. And of course, what we have already mentioned earlier, thinking about how our scholarship is implicated in ongoing police brutality and violence against Black bodies, the caging and disposability of brown bodies at the border. So engaging in critical reflexivity is important to sort of think about how our scholarship is implicated in not necessarily something that is way in the past, but an ongoing racial violence and US imperialism. And lastly, I would, I'm sure, you know, we all, like we've already talked about, agree that the future of feminist scholarship must be intersectional, even though there's a lot of shortcomings. But I think also we've, you know, Dr. Calafell, Dr. Eguchi, Dr. Chávez, and Dr. Hanchey have also talked about that, yes, you know, feminist scholarship, the future of that also must be decolonial. And decoloniality here encompasses that sense of critical reflection, deconstruction, and of course, reconstruction. So these are the three things that I put together, at least for today.
Thank you so much for your response, Dr. Asante. I definitely think that what you discussed regarding how we decolonize and make our work decolonial and continue to meet the requirements that we see of our scholarship and how we should continue to commit ourselves to that is something that's deeply important, especially as we move forward in the specific time that we are living in, but then also as we continue to preach that, as we teach classes, as we speak to others, and how we hold each other as we should to the standards that we believe are equitable and the ways in which we can free bodies from these types of violences that they're already subjected to every day. Thank you so much for that. At this point, I would like to invite Dr. Jenna Hanchey to share their response.
Thank you all for your responses, and I'm just really honored to be part of this conversation. And also, I think I'm clearly thinking along some of the same lines as Shinsuke and Godfried here, and really like wanting to talk about reflexivity. And part of it is because when Sarah and Kristen first invited me to participate, I was like, is now really a good time? Like, is my white, straight voice necessary on this panel? And as we've seen everything going on, and like what's becoming really evident right now is not just the anti-Blackness of police violence, but also the damage that white feminists can do, the damage of white feminist silence, the damage of white feminist tears, and of white feminist fragility, and that the importance of thinking about feminist trajectories that both don't center these, but also like actively disavow them and disallow their continuance, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about reflexivity, and it's something that I've been like really caught on for years and just can't figure out, because I think there's so many ways that us white feminists reflexivity while actively recentering whiteness. In a way that like Sarah Ahmed would call a non-performative manner, or like Maria Lugones would call a non-interactive engagement with difference. So I think it's something to be thinking about in feminist trajectories, how white feminists claim reflexivity as a defense mechanism rather than a substantive and continual praxis, which is what it really should be. So like the way that people list positionality characteristics as at the beginning of an essay as a defense mechanism against the important critiques of their work that need to be brought up. Or how we post articles about whiteness on social media as a defense mechanism against our own interpersonal and institutional failures. And so as a defense mechanism, I'm thinking when we use reflexivity in that manner, all it does is defend structures of whiteness, colonialism, heteronormativity, and patriarchy. And so I'm thinking about what it might look like to think of a feminist trajectory of reflexivity as a praxis of offense, not against others, but against ourselves, and a continual never-ending process of really cutting out those parts of us that continue to perpetuate injustice, that continue to try to defend whiteness. And so I'm thinking about like reflexivity as something that should hurt, like reflexivity is something that should attack the selves that we are right now, not to protect them, because attacking them is really the only way that we can create better selves, transform. So I'm thinking about how Amy Carrillo also writes, it shouldn't be individualized, because that I think is also another problem in the way that we tend to, and when I'm saying we, I'm saying like white feminists, tend to use reflexivity as this individualized act rather than a communal process that's informed by intimate relations with others. And so I think that this could be something that could really help to transform the white feminist practices in our field to be something that are actively, substantively transforming who we are, and thinking about reflexivity as a continual praxis of cutting injustices out of us. We can drop white fragility because we know we're going to mess up and that the work is never finished. It's not something that is ever done. It's ever complete. It's ever something you can let go of. So I'm thinking about, like, for the white feminists in the audience, like, how can we think about reflexivity as a praxis that that attacks those bad parts of ourselves, that is actively offensive rather than a defensive public performance.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hanchey, for that incredibly exciting consideration of reflexivity as both defense and potentially as offense. At this time, we'd like to give a slightly extended thank you to each of you that have participated today. So thank you so much, Dr. Calafell, for reminding us to focus on trans feminisms, to keep a sense of urgency in everything that we do, because we can't afford to wait, and to focus on praxis at the forefront of our work, and reminding us of the institutional and organizational impact of the places that we do that work. Thank you so much, Dr. Eguchi, for pushing us to become more critical, transnational, and nuanced, especially in our intersectional criticisms, and for reminding us of the centrality of the body for feminist work. Thank you so much, Dr. Chávez, for reminding us to always be concerned with the world's most pressing questions that are all too frequently questions of life and death. And for reminding us what feminism can be when we challenge ourselves to decenter white feminism and to ask those most pressing questions. Thank you, Dr. Asante. Thank you for calling out the exclusions that happened during the publishing process and reminding us to focus on critical reflexivity to remain relevant in current feminist communication and broader scholarship. Thank you for reminding us to always be decolonial, intersectional, and critically reflexive. And thank you, Dr. Hanchey, for reminding us of the violence caused when white feminism goes uninterrogated, for providing us a means to consider how reflexivity can work as a mode of defense that recenters white feminism, and how it might become a productive offense against ourselves and as we grow as scholars and as feminists. Thank you all so much. At this point, we'd like to open it to our group for a sort of free-form question, answer, and response session before Sarah and I offer some final remarks.
So I definitely have a question. Starting off, as a master's student, I just learned what rhetoric was 2 years ago, since I just finished. And especially, I just learned that primary facets of my identity are actually things that are very important within the communication studies discipline. But it never came to me as even something fathomable to even write about, because I never saw it around. So I was just kind of curious, because I know a lot of you focus on your own identity as kind of a starting point in writing, and engage in reflection of that as you connect it to larger, or not even larger, connect it to other mediums or artifacts as you write. How did you all start off trying to figure out that, one, writing about these things that are me are important, and how were you able to find resources that helped kind of push that forward?
I guess I'll start us off. I mean, for me, I think the big turning point was when I was an undergraduate at Arizona State University, and I had a class with Rona Halilulani, who was at that time a PhD student. And we read a piece by Lisa Flores about Chicana feminist rhetorics. And it was literally the first time that I had seen anything in communication studies that spoke to my own identity. And so I was very intentional after that about working only with women of color for my undergraduate thesis, my master's thesis, and my PhD dissertation, because I felt like they would understand why my voice mattered and I wouldn't have to do so much explaining. And then I would say the other thing was that there were also people, white people, who were there to encourage me as well. And I think specifically about Frederick Corey at Arizona State University, who the first thing he said to us in our methods class was we had to answer a question about what is communication studies in 2 pages. And I said, oh, communication studies is a racist field, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, this man is gonna think that there's something wrong with me, that I don't belong. But he was like, this is wonderful. And I fear you could find even more, more sources to support this, blah, 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 So I think that for me, it's the sense that a sense of community is what encouraged me to do that, and scarcity, because when you don't see those voices, you really want to make them present, right? And so for me, that's kind of how I came to that.
I think for me, obviously, when I started to major in communication, I was kind of struggling to understand how I should adjust to American cultures, how should I even make sense of my body in relation to other queer, bisexual, gay men, and all of that. So I was just wanting to learn about American culture. Just that's simply what it is. But I think there are certain moments that communication scholar really pushed me, because my undergrad was at San Francisco State University, and in a cultural communication class that I took with Karen Lobas, the textbook was Tom Nakayama and Judith Martin. So obviously that book there are little parts about queerness and little parts about Japanese American kind of touch me, because that speak to my identity. But then as I'm moving on to master PhD at postdoc, I was actually a postdoc at University of Denver, and my mentor is Bernadette Calafell. And at that time, I was a little bit more doing social science-y, like kind of traditional work, but all Bernadette did was, hey, we need to sit down, just part of the regular meeting. She just said, why don't you read a Black queer studies book? I think that will help you. Boom. 80 years later, here I am. So Bernadette, like, I owe her a lot. And I know people think I might be kissing her ass. No, she literally did one thing. Look at the book. Everything else come naturally after that. So for that, really, like, this community that I've been lucky that I've been around many scholars until my tenure track. Like, Bernadette was my postdoc mentor, Will Strasta, Black feminist, Melbourne Cumming, who does Afrocentricity, Deborah Borisov at NYU, San Francisco State is Victoria Chen and Karen Loba. So I think for me, those community of scholars, including white scholars, actually really encourage me to do this work. And there are good white people, like Jenna, for instance, but there are also bad white people that I want to happy to critique them. So call me for that.
I thought you were going to name names there with the bad white people right after you named the good one. I just want to jump in real quick and say I think it's also important to say that there's many ways you can insert yourself into your scholarship and find ways to be reflected in it. I think that usually we think of that, or a lot of grad students start out thinking of that as needing to be a kind of question of personal narrative or autoethnography, which of course it can be that, but it can also be any number of things, right? It can be questions that you're wrestling with that aren't directly about your identity, or it can be, Jeff Bennett's recent book on diabetes. He's a type 2 diabetic. The book is not about him. It's not autoethnographic at all, but that's how he became interested in the subject. So I think there's also lots of ways to do that. And depending on the program you go to, you'll get steered to maybe do none of that, maybe to do it in a particular way that doesn't actually involve the personal narrative at all, or, some programs actually really foster the personal narrative. But, I should add, it can be, that path can be really challenging. You can get reviewers who will be vicious, people who will say it's me-search, it's not research, and to be fair, some autoethnography is like reading someone's journal, but the really good stuff is really good scholarship, but it can still, it's a craft, and it can be treated pretty negatively. So I think it's important to kind of think about what ways you might want to insert yourself in your scholarship.
So, all right, so I think in my case, it was Dr. Eguchi who actually introduced me to a lot of work that, especially autoethnography. During my master's, I had the view of the traditional research where you collect data and then you present the data. There wasn't even much of an emphasis for critical reflexivity in the research. And I should say that even in grad school, encountering autoethnography and working with it, I was scared because, of course, thinking about the job market right after and talking about what Dr. Chávez just talked about too, that some reviewers will be really harsh with you. So it was a struggle, right? So thinking about what is my future with this methodology after school. But then I realized that there were actually there were a lot of researchers who were doing this. So that really encouraged me. But the other part of this also was that autoethnography, or even narrative, the focus on my body in research was something that helped me to reveal a lot about myself, and also about how I was, in some sense, I had imbibed this colonial versions of myself. And autoethnography really helped me to unpack that, what it meant. Because you're growing up, you're told several things about what it means to be queer, to be African, and autoethnography in relation to the kinds of the feedback that I got from doing autoethnography really helped me to unpack a lot about myself as well. So it did really help, especially when your background is not that popular. You'll not find that many queer African scholars in communication studies. So autoethnography really helped me a lot to think through things, especially to be very self-reflexive, and especially Dr. Eguchi, at least who is here now, of course, helped me really a lot to think through that. Yeah.
I would love to pose a question that I think can really sort of bounce off what you just said, Dr. Asante, because as we've been talking, some of those questions and thoughts about method continue to come up for me as I'm listening to each of you, and I think that's directly tied to some of the organizational and institutional stuff, specifically the Doctors Chávez and Calafell were talking about, and so I'm wondering, autoethnography has already come up a few times, and I think that's awesome because it's definitely one of the methods I'm most excited about. But I'm wondering if each of you have something in your mind, some sort of method or methodological practice that you're most excited about right now, that you feel like is really designed or can be utilized in a way that forwards feminist research in the sorts of ways that we've been talking about today.
I actually want to add to that. I think for me, I mean, obviously many kinds of methods, especially critical cultural methodology is great, but I think because, as I said earlier, my training was more traditional communication research for my PhD, master, bachelor's, I really respect for those who are really very creative and performative. So I really want to say, for those who do a performance studies work, I so like respect them, and I don't know how I can write sometimes nicely the quotes or even the doc to formulate, like, how do you call it, like the space and all of those things. I mean, I'm a foreign person, so it takes time for me to do, but so for me, those people like, Dawn Marie McIntosh, of course, Bernadette, many other performance studies people, like, I so like how they do, because it's beautifully written, but I can't do it, so that's maybe one of the things I want to add to that.
I will say, I think you do a beautiful job with the work that you do in autoethnography, Shinsuke. And I will say that I'm a little disenchanted with performance studies right now because I've been disenchanted with it for some time, but the glaring whiteness of it and the lack of citationality, as well as the sense that we're all about social justice when it's really not, as well as the idea of we have hope, and that's where it ends, right? So
and I should have said performance people of color's work. Or
So
yeah.
I would say that. So that's part of my feeling, which goes back to your question, is where I'm excited about right now. I started out as a rhetorician, and so I'm excited about going back and doing some work. I'm returning to my roots, believe it or not, going back to Chicano Latino studies in some of the work I've been doing lately in the queer of color critique, bringing those together. So I'm really excited about that, as well as like trans-border studies, so that kind of thing is where I'm excited about. But that's just like I'm old and curmudgeon-y, so I get to say that I'm disenchanted with performance, but
I am super excited about the special issue that Amber Johnson, Benny Lemaster, Ronaldo Anderson, and Kelly are putting together for Common Critical Cultural Studies on speculative fiction. So they've put out a call for speculative fiction pieces that address liberated futures. So imagining how we get to and what liberated look like in intersectional fashions. And I'm just really excited that we've got a communication journal that is publishing speculative fiction based on our research that really pushes towards liberation in imaginative ways that break out of colonialism, that break out of racism, that break out of heteronormativity. I'm just really excited for what's going to come out of that special issue.
I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of boring methodologically. Like, I think I'm not as interested in method as I am in methodology. I'm interested in research questions. I'm interested in what's the best way to get at the thing. And so, usually for me, the kinds of questions I'm interested in are going to require, a deep engagement with some kind of text. And that's pretty traditional, but I think now more than ever, we need that kind of analysis. We need people digging into language, digging into argument to show the logics by which it operates. And so, yeah, that's always excited about that, still excited about that.
Cool. Well, with that, we've taken the hour of your time that we asked for, but I do want to provide some space if there's any final comments or questions from anybody before Sarah and I offer just a couple sentences to say goodbye and wrap up this meeting today.
No, thank you for inviting us. I mean, I think it was a really productive conversation, and then I'm excited to hear the thoughts of my colleagues. So thank you.
Thank you for coordinating.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
Thank you so much, everybody. Before our last couple sentences, we just wanted to make a quick correction. We apologize, Dr. Asante. I think we misspoke with your organizational affiliation here. So Dr. Asante is an assistant professor of communication at Drake University. Did I get that right, Sarah? Yes, did I get that right? I could also, yes, Dr. Asante. Perfect, okay, great. Well, just before we went, we wanted to say that we recognize that the road ahead for feminists and feminist work in our discipline is long and winding.
Your work here today has helped make it appear traversable and fantastically transformational, and started in a very important conversation that hopefully a lot more people in our field, whether that be graduate students, professors, or undergraduates, can now all access and begin to ask these questions themselves.
So thank you.
Thank you.